A couple things I want to cover. One is, what in the real world, what happens when you have an admissibility hearing. Typically, you're going to have a subpoena already, and you're going to get that phone call. And they're like, well, your subpoena's for 2 days, but we need you for admissibility hearing the next day. And everything goes through your mind from, who are you going to have to do it? Can I get somebody? How hard would it be for me to get Jenny Smith here and give my admissibility package for tape? So, and she doesn't want to do that. So she gets pulled pretty thin a lot of times. And so this is a way that hopefully, the way this is set up, you could tweak this presentation and have it ready and, do the admissibility package yourself. So one of the things that I've done is I've thrown a bunch of things in here. The PowerPoint has a lot of slides in it, so I'm going to be whipping through them. And so, and you would have to tweak it. Kind of the premise behind this is part of the SWGMAT subgroups. They all were told one of the things you ought to work on is admissibility package. And there's a couple reasons that as a tape group, we had a lot of the resources already in hand. We had several documents that we wanted to work off of. But one of our goals was to get it out there right away. The information was there. And we didn't necessarily want it published, copyrighted, or anything else. We want people to be able to take this presentation and steal all the slides, steal all the information, and right away, and use it as they can. And every case is going to be slightly different. So if you're doing electrical tape or packaging tape, so this is just a starting point that you would have to tweak and hopefully be able to do admissibility package with almost no notice, just a little bit of tweaking. And with that, this has not gone through the SWGMAT group as far as being approved and so forth. It's my spin on how I would do an admissibility package. So, a couple objectives. One is, if I was doing a admissibility package, I would have, the first thing I would do is just say, how do you do tape exams? So there's a bunch of slides on here that hopefully you could use also if you were going to educate personnel that are collecting paint, or why would you do a tape exam? Why would you do a tape exam? So when you're educating your law enforcement in your area. So hopefully you can steal those slides as well for that. And also I want to disseminate where the other SWGMAT tape documents are. And the admissibility package for court purposes, this should be on the website, so you should be able to steal it in a couple weeks. There are a couple other things I threw in there. One is, of course, you would want a tape bibliography, and it has 60-some references on it that you could use and say, okay, here's every tape article that's been presented in the different journals and things, as well as also a tape survey that the SWGMAT tape group sent out in 1999. I included the results from that on it. It was never published. And also a sourcing bibliography with comments. If you're doing something like sourcing, of course, this admissibility package would have to be changed, but that would, it talks about databases and so forth, so you could hopefully rush and get that done as well. A couple of disclaimers. I'm going to be rushing through this. This isn't a tape lecture as such, so I'm not going to, talk in detail on some of the techniques. It's just there in pictures and stuff so you could use them. And of course, you would have to take out the first 4 slides, and you're going to have to modify the presentation. There's things in here that if you're not sequencing, if you're not sourcing, if you're doing electrical tape, you would have to change the presentation. And also some of the ideas and topics of the presentation were taken from others. I already mentioned Andrea Meltrotter and Lee Bruncani and Sue Gross and Jenny Smith on the tape group. A lot of the ideas were from the documents that we have produced from the SWGMAT tape group. But I also got other topics, like one of the slides on here is I stole from Amy Mashad. It's on a little card exchange principle. So there's some slides on there that I stole from other people. as well as some of the members in the Indiana State Police Trace Unit. If I'm doing a technical review for Kathy Boone and, I saw a nice cross-section in her report, I just said, hey, send that to me. I want to put it in my presentation. So I did steal some things along the way. I did try to make it a generic presentation, specifically mostly geared towards duct tape, since that's what most people see. But I think it would be fairly applicable. I tried to take off all things like brand names on instruments, on Spectra, and so forth. The presentation itself, how I would present it, has a lot of physical characteristics and things like that that I thought a jury would understand. It's very limited on some of the instrumentation that you would do, as well as it's limited on the tape production. So I did kind of cut corners because myself, I would not present that in admissibility packages. Some of the common sense slides I will just discuss briefly so you kind of understand what kind of picture or what I was trying to convey. And of course, I've already kind of mentioned with a different analysis scheme, if you don't have a specific instrument or something, you would have to modify it, or if you're doing sourcing or electrical tape and so forth. So the first thing, of course, you would want to cover is associative evidence. And everybody is, if you're in forensics, knows this as far as common origin. Whether it be, duct tape on a modified anhydrous, cylinder or something, and you're trying to do it to a roll. But you would have to tell that to the court, as well as, there's two other things you can do, sequencing and then sourcing, where the hand's tied before the feet, and so forth. If there's multiple suspects, who was tied up first, things like that. And here's just a slide that, just talks about, it's a little bit hard to see always with pictures, but these are different colors. And I always, if I'm going to be in court, I would always go with the null hypotheses type thing of, as a trace analyst or associative evidence, I'm trying to find a difference. I look at it as these two things aren't similar, and I'm going to try to find their difference, and that, that's my goal, is to see if there's a significant difference so I can eliminate them. And I have no problem telling people that as an analyst, if I find a difference, say, in color on the backing, my job is done. So that's the easiest exam you hope for. Sometimes people think that you hope that things are similar, but in reality, the quickest and easiest exam is when you find a difference. So from an analyst standpoint, and then of course, then there's the positive association with a physical end match. And you would have to explain that to a jury. With the sequencing, there's duct tape often is cut off the hands and the wrist, and so you would have to do the different ends. And then sourcing is one of those things that, with databasing and so forth, that it can be attempted with duct tape, and again, it depends on how your sourcing libraries and tape manufacturing resources are. The first document that I would probably go into then is, there is one document, Forensic Examination of Tapes, that the SWGMAT Tape Group put out, and it was published in Forensic Science Communications, and it has the citing there. There's also, you would also probably want, even if it is just on duct tape, you'd want to probably cover the different types of tapes. There's office tape, Scotch tape, there's packaging tape, the mop and bops, there's electrical tape, there's strapping tape, there's cloth tape, or medical tape, there's duct tape, there's masking tape. Tape variability, there are differences, and this is kind of the crux of why you can do a tape exam, and especially if you're trying to educate for your investigators. The physical and chemical characteristics are consistent throughout the roll. One roll varies from a different roll. Some of the other tape conclusions, basically this is the results that you can have. You can have the two tapes were once, this has same source, and then you can also have that they were similar or that they were different. A couple other things to consider with the extraneous material. By the nature, adhesives are great for attracting other fibers and so forth. And there's a roll-light fingerprint on there if you look at the tape too as well. What order of exam you're going to do. And also untangling the tape. Sometimes you have to discuss that in court if you've done that. And this is the slide I stole from Amy, but it is a nice slide when you're trying to do it, And sometimes, I did I testified on an electrical tape case 15 years ago, and the thing they cared about most was they had, the chalk line. It was a fluorescent pink chalk line that was in the toolbox, and it got on both the question piece of tape and the roll. They were more interested in that, So, sometimes you do have to explain that we do look for that in a tape exam. And this is a slide, you saw this if you were at with Jenny's presentation yesterday. If you have to go a little bit on tape construction just to kind of go in depth. And different people, depending on your backgrounds, are going to cover this in different depths. And then, of course, you have, this is what you do. You have you do a physical match, physical characteristics, PLM, FTIR, elemental, pyrolysis, and you're looking at the adhesive, the scrim fabric, and polyethylene film. Physical characteristics, and this isn't a typo. There's 5 documents in total that SWGMAT has gotten through the group. So it went from the tape subgroup to the SWGMAT, and they've been passed, all 5. There's 3 of them in here. The one has already been published. There's 3 more that have been put into Forensic Science Communications just about a month ago. They don't think it's going to be published till April of 2010. And I did put that on here because I wanted you to know it was coming. If someone does, if you're writing your tape, best practices, or you're doing training or something and you really want to get a hold of these documents, Forensic Science Communications did tell me that I do have it on Adobe on a thumb drive that says draft copy. But she did say that since it's going to be so long since it's published in Forensic Science Communications, that these 3 documents that say April 2010, if you really have to have a copy, I can get it to you. A stereo microscope, where I'm not going to cover some of these, but they, of course, with puzzle matching, different people have different things, pictures apart and then pictures close and so forth. With physical end matching, you would have to describe that to the court. And then once you start going at the physical characteristics, sometimes it's nice just to look at everything that you're doing. Yarn construction, yarn counts, fiber examination, and each of these are a big topic. I mean, fiber examination is huge. I've made it real small here because sometimes it's hard to, you can't, you got to limit what you cover even in a admissibility hearing. And then I have a bunch of slides here just on some of the simple physical characteristics like the backing color, the adhesive color. These are just simple things that does vary quite a bit, and you want to let the jury know that. Scrim, you got to tell them a little bit about what scrim is, that there's different types of scrim, and of course in that you're going to compare the scrim, and I think anybody can see that, these are different, and depending on, what you've done in a case, just things like scrim offset, how far does that scrim come to the edge of the tape will vary, and it'll be consistent throughout the roll. So some things like that, you want to cover all sorts of things, the yarn examination or fiber examination, if it's polyester, is it pentalobal, all those type of things you'd want to cover. Tape width, and again, if you, manufacturing-wise, haven't covered a whole lot on tape manufacture, but with the slitters, they have different widths on duct tape. It's 2-inch tape, but there are differences, and you can cover, later on I'm going to cover a bunch of references and documents, but the difference there is an ASTM document out there specifically on what the dimensions are for tape to call it a 2-inch tape. So the tape industry has some ASTM documents and stuff on that. The tape backing and thickness, this is just a real quick slide that if you're doing thickness on tape, how you might do it, put it between two slides and so forth. Just some of the different surface characteristics on the backing. This is a nice slide to educate the jury that there are some markings on the back of tape that you look at and so forth. And there are multiple layers in the backing. Forensic Science Communications has an article that's been published on tape backings. You can compare them. This is a 3-layer backing on a duct tape. The aluminum flake layers in the center. So there are 2 or 3 different that are much more common today than they used to be. And then you can go over adhesives that you cover and do testing on. Here's another document for light microscopy that will be coming out in Forensic Science Communications. And I don't cover this real far in depth. If you're doing MOP or BOP, it's really hard to cover that. That's a huge, would be a lot of slides. Here's a comparison microscope slide of 2 pieces of tape. This has the adhesive on it. You can see the aluminum flake layer as well as the layer in between the adhesive. And one of the things I just wanted to mention real quick that a lot of people never talk about is if you look at the particle size distribution, the particle size can vary in the adhesive, and even though if elementally and chemistry-wise it's the same, something that a lot of times you can look at when you're looking at with light microscopy. It's something that should be at least noted. And a little bit on PLM if you want to get into that, and especially if you're doing MOP or BOP tapes, that becomes very important. Of course, FTIR, and I'm not going to go into theory or anything, but a few slides on, the fill fibers. These are, polyester, and the adhesive, the concentrations vary. Spectral comparisons, you can compare them. If you get into, you take one, you compare question and known to the jury. The duct tape backing, and then elemental techniques. So there's a lot of different ones. Swig map tape-wise, we've covered, IR and light microscopy and physical characteristics, and the SEM, or the elemental analysis one, has been approved by the whole group, and we are working on some of the other ones like ICP and Prowl's GC mass spec and some of those techniques as well as like a training manual module. And then SEM, a little bit on it. And here's, again, a comparison that you can kind of see differences between the top side and adhesive side. And then on the adhesive for an electrical tape. Tape conclusions. Here's the crux of why you do tape exams, basically, and I kind of had this slide in there before. This is what you can tell the jury. Either these are similar or they're different, or they were once connected to and part of the same role. Now get into the Daubert, and this is just how I would present it. I think you would have to educate a jury or the court or the judge, whoever you're trying to convince, that, and this afternoon, I guess, with the Daubert presentation, they may have a different take on it, but I would want to cover fairly, simply what you do in a tape exam. But then getting to the Daubert Guidelines, I'll kind of go through some of these, and I think everybody has seen these, and I think they're going to cover these this afternoon. But just a little bit of my takes on some of these. And here's basically the theory. Since tape can vary in physical construction and chemical composition from one roll to another, it's good associative evidence. If it was always the same, then but the crux of it is that a single roll of tape has similar properties to, itself, but it's different than other ones. And this belief is supported by the literature. That's basically the tape variability theory that we work on. Even though every roll of tape has not been tested, if you heard Jenny yesterday talk about the industry and how everything changes constantly, it's really impossible to test every roll. And so one of the things, I heard Jay Siegel talk just about a year ago, and he mentioned, he kind of had this theory of falsifiability, which I didn't put that on here because I wasn't sure it was a word. But on falsifiability, essentially every time I drop a rock, it's going to fall and hit the ground. Well, has anybody ever tested every rock out there to see if it will actually fall down? No, but it's believed to be true until someone does it, and it doesn't happen that way. So kind of the same thing with tape. Until we have studies that show that this theory can be proven wrong, we accept it. And so I listed a couple articles that I like that have that kind of talk about the same class, the different tapes, variability. So even though these duct tapes or these electrical tapes, how much variability they have. And then are they consistent through the roll? And there's several articles. And again, with the bibliography that you're going to be getting, you should be able to look through that bibliography, and you can pick out, you have articles I'm sure that you like that demonstrate that theory. And then of course the different techniques, whether you want pyrolysis GC or ICP-MS or whatever technique you're using. Fluorescence spectroscopy. There's techniques that are covered in different journals on the different techniques. And as far as peer review goes, that's part of the admissibility guidelines. There's a lot of ASTM articles. The SWGMAT documents, tape documents will be eventually ASTM documents, and then they'll be reviewed every 5 years. But there's a lot of the tape articles that are in different journals. They're well respected and peer reviewed. A couple other information that I would try to let the court know. The Pressure Sensitive Tape Council, they have nothing to do with forensics, but they have everything to do about tape. That's their livelihood. And they're in the European, they have a counterpart over there as well to the Pressure Sensitive Tape Council that they make rules and regulations basically for the tape industry. There's a couple different books, and I've listed 3 of them there that are very helpful when it comes to tape analysis. And the last one is the book of Forensic Analysis on the Cutting Edge. There's a whole chapter dedicated to tape analysis. So, and there, of course, at regional societies and so forth, So in a formal setting, I mentioned the 4 articles there that will be published very, very soon, the last 3. And also there's the European Paint and Glass Working Group that Stefan Becker was, he mentioned the other day that has a tape group as well. And I would, standards controlling the techniques as well. There not only are there, are those documents, but there's also documents from ASTM. And I think it's beneficial that they're not specifically forensic articles, that they're that you would need to demonstrate that these guidelines for tape are out there for the tape industry. So if you look at the bottom there's 27 active guidelines specifically for testing methods for pressure-sensitive tape. So there's a lot of guidelines out there for tape, even if they're not forensics. But then also there's tons of guidelines on fibers, fabrics, plastics, rubber, and everything, and as well as all the different techniques. I started to go through ASTM and kind of look through the different techniques, and it was, there's too many of them to list. So I just said there's lots of them. So error rate, I want to cover real quick. The error rate is 98.63%. No. One of the things that for error rate that everybody thinks of, and we think of as scientists, is that you have to come up with a number. But if you look at, in my opinion, the admissibility package, why some of the guidelines for Daubert, you don't really have to come up with a number. They just want it addressed. So this is the same people that, believe beyond a reasonable doubt. So in my opinion, you don't have to look for a specific error rate. But, people have training that they want it addressed. So how do you eliminate it? So the scientist has completed competencies and so forth. You have peer reviews, you have technical reviews, you're using proper equipment that has protocol on how to use it, you have training experience, so forth. And the other thing that I heard someone mention that, with corrective action, one of the reasons why I believe it's almost impossible to have a specific error rate has to do with the fact that, hopefully every laboratory is improving. So if you have a corrective action, your error rate, if you miss a proficiency test, then your error rate has decreased. So hopefully you've put steps in place to lower that error rate constantly. And again, I mentioned there is an external proficiency out there now from forensic testing services that specifically for the forensic tape examination that's available as well. And again, there's no way to say, I have a root canal planned for next Monday. If I go in and do any work, it's going to be in question. So to give an error rate for method or for specific individual is almost, in my opinion, impossible. But we do know that we are confident, and I believe these results be true, and we stick behind our work. And then general acceptance with microscopy and so forth, and instrumentation. I think that, there's lots of things, the literature out there, and I think everybody has seen the general acceptance. So, federal, state. So, and the last thing I have on here, I just have like 2 slides left. In May of 2000, the SWGMAT tape group sent out surveys, and that is one of the things that Jocelyn has said will be on the website for your availability is the results of that survey. It was just, what are labs doing out there for tape? How many tape cases are you getting? What techniques are you using? So as far as general acceptance, we all know, we all talk to each other, and we all know we kind of all do the same thing anyways, but that was kind of a nice little thing for court purposes wise that might be helpful. And also a previous court decision. This is one you might ask Maureen Bradley about, but it was, this one was specifically for a fracture match on duct tape, and she worked with it. So. But that, that would be a nice citing to have for admissibility as well. So I guess conclusion, I think it meets the Daubert Guideline. In my opinion, this was, you could use this presentation, steal it, rob it. I did send it to, I was kind of glad because Tammy Jurgovich, the SWGMAT paint group chair, emailed me on the week before I came out here, said, hey, we're working on ours. How are you guys doing it? And I said, well, you can have this. Please steal it. Please steal all these slides. Why duplicate work? But if there's anything in here that you can use, but this is how I would do an admissibility package, and hopefully it's helpful or beneficial. Let me know if something happens and you can't pull off the information in a couple weeks off the website.